Q&A. And to set the stage for us to think about how to do this, a perfect opportunity came along, which is the ongoing planning of Beacon Yards in Allston. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about the project and give you all a short primer about it for those that haven't been attending the meetings in Allston organized by the task force and by MassDOT. I'll talk about that in a minute. But more broadly, I want to explain how this event has been organized. Tonight is the launch. It's going to be organized as a panel discussion. We've got an excellent lineup of people that Renee's going to introduce. Is this true to Renee? They're going to set the stage of some of the broader issues raised by the Allston project and where urban design might fit into the equation from a process standpoint and on the policy side, even from a decision-making standpoint. So that'll be the theme tonight. And it's going to launch then a 2-day professional charrette, modeled a little bit like the ULI SWAT teams, or maybe a very good model for this, for those that are familiar, the Mayor's Institute for City Design, where they get professionals to come huddle with mayors to think about urban design issues. And we've got 2 superstar teams, one headed by Alex Krieger from MBBJ. Alex, there he is. He's all ears tonight. And Kishore Vinarsi, who's the head of urban design at CBT. And then the Urban Design Committee of the BSA put out a call for people to participate. And we've got enough talented young people that know Rhino and SketchUp and Illustrator, and that they can actually come up with 2 visions in 2 days, which is a little bit insane, but it's how you get volunteers. And the other piece of this, too, I think, is to let strong diagrams and concepts come together quickly in a context that everybody understands that that's all they are. They're not meant to parallel or be equivalent to the very careful engineering that MassDOT is doing to solve a real engineering issue. And I want to be very clear that this is fundamentally an important and serious transportation engineering problem, but given the size of the land and the issues at stake, maybe it's an urban design problem too. So that's where this is headed. The reporting back of the teams is going to happen at 4 p.m. on Thursday at the Jackson Mann Community Center in Allston, just before the MassDOT public meeting, which we thought was a way to truly engage. So that's the plan. And the information on the BSA website spells all this out. And we have a plan that we haven't finalized yet to report back here in about 3 weeks, back at home base here for the larger design community, after we've packaged up the workshop results, package it with a little bit of a kind of intro, and develop it into a kind of a white paper. And we'll have that distributed here at an event. So stay tuned about the day and time for that, but that's in the works. We just want to make sure that Kishore and Alex and key people can be here for that. So any questions about the agenda? I should also add that other experts are joining the teams, the professional teams. Both teams have a transportation planner on their team. Both teams have a landscape architect and other assorted, and I have a Venn diagram to explain this, so just hold on. I've got a Venn for everything. So if that's good enough, the plan is going to be that I'm going to give a 15, 20-minute overview of the issues that are at stake. And then Renee is going to take it over. I'm going to sit up with the panelists, and we're going to have at it, if that makes sense. Okay? Gretchen. And also, I was meant to say that there's both a general sign-in sheet if you're here, because our friends and partners at APA, the American Planning Association, would like a list of who's here and why they came. Tad Reed is here from APA and others, but we're going to get more closely collaborated. Is that the word? We're going to collaborate more closely for the next workshop, which is probably going to be in February, theme to be announced. So we're also using this to make friends with ULI and APA and all in ASLA and all of our friends here in town. So here we go. So I think everybody in the room knows where Beacon Yards are. If you're truly coming to this for the first time, this is a very helpful map. not only to show you where it's located, but give you a sense that it's about the same size as the combination of the public garden and the common, just at a kind of large scale look at the city. And this is an aerial view. By the way, I taught a studio on the site before it was announced that the highway was going to be moved in 2009 at Yale. And of course, one of the Yale students was actually a pilot. So he went up and actually took a photograph for the studio. But that's a whole other comment. And at the time, I think that both Harvard, who owns the land, and certainly other planners that were beginning to look at it realized that the capture of real estate there was very difficult because the buildable parcels were trapped between the rail corridor, the existing interchange, with very few limited access points to get in, mostly access points that were used. There were 2 by trucks to get into the site. And so the uncapping of the value of that was going to be very, very difficult with the highway interchange where it's located. And by the way, nobody imagined in 2009 that the interchange was going to be moved, even Yale students who are always ready to redesign the world. So it gives you a perspective on things. Maybe the state was discussing it the way they do, not behind closed doors, I can't say that, but there you go. Fast forward to today, and I'm not going to go through the evolution of the plans over the last couple of months. Many of you here have been to the meetings and know the story much better than I do. People on my staff, my graduate students are also here from Northeastern who have been researching this to a high level of detail. But this is the current sort of favored skeleton plan. It's called Plan 3F, and this is not the plan that's going to be presented on Thursday, but from the last meeting, which shows the interchange being moved over while preserving a couple of tracks to allow the commuter rail to work at South Station. You need these layover tracks to get more trains in and out. This is as close as trains can get to at rush hour to stage those things. So there's a reason why there's still a mini rail yard that remains. And otherwise, you can see the old highway below. The Pike has been moved as far to the south as possible. And then the real discussion has been, how do the on and off ramps become relatively reasonable surface streets as soon as possible? And this is where urban design and I would say highway engineering, where the rubber really first hits the road, where the highway engineer's interests about coming off and slowing down to a point where you actually stop to turn meets highway regulations, and then that experience from there beyond allows for buildings that have addresses and things to touch the ground. And that's one of the questions of the project. The other thing that's been the other part of the project that's been a point of controversy is the idea of what's called West Station. Like the Yawkey Station at Fenway Park, there are probably a lot of logical reasons to have another commuter rail stop here. And this is a scheme that acknowledges that by having some of these ramps swing over the rail yard at a level above the train tracks for drop-off and pick-up at West Station, with less of a clear idea about how you access it from the BU side. So that's another spicy thing in the mix here, which is West Station and its role or not relative to the highway plan. And so the other thing that's important about this drawing, which took me a while to learn and read like, it's another language, is that the yellow streets are at grade. The blue streets are bermed up as bermed ramps, and the red things are bridges. And what's very complicated about this is that the Pike is actually under Cambridge Street here, and that it has to very quickly get up above the train tracks there before it dies under Comm Ave again. Everyone knows the big roller coaster. The roller coaster will still exist, but have to happen more quickly because the curve is out of it, so it's got to all happen. And that's why this bridge is pretty far up there. That's a bridge over a berm that's already almost a bridge, if that makes sense. And so that the tidy plans are actually quite complicated in 3D, and quite frankly are much more highway-like. I want to say that the task force and the advocacy groups have been doing an excellent job raising issues along the way. For very rational reasons, Highway Engineers are running this project on the consultant side and at MassDOT. The advocacy community has been arguing about walkable streets, about bicycling, about right-sized blocks, you know, the all the good stuff. And if you track these schemes 1 month to the next, you see that that MassDOT is listening as much as they can relative to the highway engineering challenges of the project. And so this is a proto master plan that I think was produced in collaboration by BTD and the BRA. True, Tad? He said I've done my homework. That at least suggests ideologically the idea that you take some of the grids that Harvard has been proposing as part of its Alston plan, and you just carry that kind of happy urbanism across into the Beacon Yards area. And so with even some identifiers about what some of those things might mean. So urban design has begun through the advocacy of the city in this case, with a plan like this, to enter into the discussion. And the result of that has been, quite frankly, still some slightly Frankenstein monster solutions. For example, when highway engineers see this, they say, okay, we'll just have another more ramp-looking thing halfway between the two. And where we're headed here, which is why urban design is critical, is that what's happening as this thing gets domesticated, you know, highways being beaten into a city, is that we're ending up de facto, without any positive look at them, parcels that are maybe pretty weird, you know. So what we're left with then are places where there's going to be city building. And so I think this is also one of the challenges to the charrette teams, which is, you know, how does a vision for the city in a way, this is the critical moment before things are inked here. Does a grid like this actually work at all for, you know, modern market rate real estate to provide a vision for what might want to go here, you know, you name it. Also, I love you know, today, these days, in the blogosphere, people do counter proposals. And this is the most awesome one. I don't know if, I've never met him before, David Martz. He's a preservation student at the BAC. It proves to you what a little software skill can do. He came up with this counter proposal that my students and I studied that in some ways doesn't make any sense at all. For example, the rail yard isn't doing any good over there, but has other good ideas, like a direct way to get from the Pike directly to Starrow Drive without going onto Cambridge Street. Seems like a pretty good idea. Also an idea, too, that you might need some open space to resolve the weird grids that happen there. So check out David's blog. It's worth looking at. He's easily findable. The other part of the story, of course, is a very interesting one, which is that Beacon Yards is owned by Harvard and MassDOT, and that's it. And I wanted to show you some relevant plans from Harvard's institutional master plan they filed with the city to show you, as we get closer to Beacon Yards, what Harvard has been imagining and proposing very reasonably. One is this greenway that happens parallel to Western Ave, but a little bit south of it, that's meant to be a little bit of a fuzzy boundary between academic-leaning buildings and what they're really considering to be a kind of Harvard's version of Kendall Square. They call it the Enterprise Zone or something. And so one can imagine that this is a color coding of those uses. Enterprise Research Campus. Doesn't sound that urban to me, but it looks urban, but it doesn't sound urban. And then a kind of mixed use along Western Ave. And that, you know, that's a question then about if you follow the logics of their plan into Beacon Yards, maybe or maybe not what makes the most sense in terms of future uses. The other player, of course, is BU, and specifically what their plans are for the West Campus, how that might relate to their interest in or not the West Station. This is also from their IMP. And they identify quite a few proposed development sites right along the edge there, kind of at the corner of their map, but where it abuts the proposed station and the southern end of Beacon Yard. So I think that you've got a very interesting and a unique situation here that you basically have three property owners. And then we have the whole city here kind of having ideas about what they should do. That's the fascination of this whole thing. So what I'd like to do to kind of finish this discussion is to calibrate a little bit or recalibrate what lens we should be looking through, what lenses we should be looking through from a disciplinary standpoint at the site. I would say that the majority of the thinking has been transportation planning, and by that I mean not just highway designers, but bicycle planners, pedestrian advocates, all of the advocates, even most of the advocacy has been around transportation planning, quite frankly, which has had a good effect. But I would make the claim relative to our charrette that both landscape architecture and architecture have a role to play too, and a role even to help fix the infrastructure. And so, that's the right answer right there. I've got these kind of called out, and their overlap as something else we'd like to bring to the table. So a couple of things that architects have started to think about, namely my 10 graduate students at Northeastern, which is if you take the MassDOT map and turn it into a Rhino model, 3D, this thing suddenly has physical ramifications. And we haven't gotten into a level of detail yet to show all the structure and everything, but these are major structures in their own right. And so just the act of drawing through what they are physically is going to have implications relative to how we respond to it as designers. The other thing that we wanted to do, and my students just started last week, but I had them working very quickly, is to understand relative to the question of parcels and city building, how big the space actually was. So they made a big puzzle piece. This is, Beacon Yards that isn't the highway. And then they went cutting it like a cookie cutter out of different neighborhoods in Boston. So here they're cutting out to the same scale Back Bay, and they're dropping it in. It's quite a big area. It runs all the way from past Mass Ave to like Fairfield Street. This is a little bit unfair, but we took a big chunk of Beacon Hill. Not the whole State House, though, and dropped it in. And then maybe a more relevant example, they cut out a piece of Kendall Square and dropped that in. And this is relevant because this is how big buildings come in the modern market economy. Unless you tamp down through design guidelines the scale of buildings, that's how big they are. And this is important, I think, relative to the fact that MassDOT is backing into parcels, maybe parcels that are innocent to what actually wants to go there. So I'm going to talk now about what those parcels are. This is, if you ask a developer what buildings are going to go here, this is the first daydream that they have. Office building, flex, light lab on the left, residential, or it could be a dormitory like one of BU's dorms, a residential point tower, or a hotel. And so the question is the plan that's ending up there geared to the kind of city we want to have happen there and the kind of neighborhood? In 2009, when I taught the Yale studio, we made some prototypes that were actually smart models that had the embedded data in them. And then I had the students drop them into the site and do the best they could without distorting those buildings. And this not surprisingly, it looks like Kendall Square. It looks like part of the seaport. These are two different versions. Only the point being that now is about the time we should test these sites for a couple of different scenarios. Should it be student housing village? Should it be Harvard's Kendall Square? Should it be geared to allow both to happen? Should it be another thing that we can't even imagine? These are questions, I think, that provocations that are worth considering. And in fact, many other sites that are the same size that have been planned actually begin with building typologies as part of the planning process. Battery Park City is a very good example in New York. And we can even think of former rail yards in Boston, like North Point, and even like the Prudential Center, which used to be a rail yard, being former rail yards where the question of real estate economics and city building and urban design have entered into the debate a little bit earlier. The other value of this is that you can rapid prototype the kinds and number of people that might actually be here. So by embedding data into these prototypes, and this again was just a kind of quick run of types without manipulating them, this team knew that there were going to be 8,000 office workers and 7,000 residents just through a simple. It's good to know early on in a process. The other piece of this that's very important is landscape architecture, landscape urbanism, whatever term you want to use. That could also be a very strong driver. There's many ways at this. The hydrology of the site. The most interesting, I thought, for today's discussion was to understand the hydrology of the site and the history. From the site, it's very interesting. It's hard to see here, but there are two outflows into the Charles River from the site that, in our research looking at Boston water and sewer maps, are actually covered stream beds and not outflows of the storm sewer system. And in fact, we discovered that one of them is the buried Salt Creek, which actually defines the geometry of Common as it leaves the straight portion and runs out, into Brookline, which is pretty cool. So somewhere under there is a culvert that follows the line of Salt Creek. And so our curiosity was stoked. That's the site. This is the tidal line of the former estuary. That's Salt Creek, running around the kind of hills of Brookline there. And by the way, the Alston was originally pasture land for the city, both cattle and horses. It was a very productive pasture land for a growing city, and the history of the pasture lands existed for quite a long time. This is the railroad coming through. That's Salt Creek. It still exists. And one of the last remnants, by the way, of the pasture lands was on the site what was called the Beacon Trotting Park, which is where you went to race your buggy. It was a horse buggy racetrack. And that's why the railroads took it over, because it was the last soft spot for a rail yard relative to other ownership patterns. There was, by the way, a stockyard right here relative to these earlier uses. And there's Salt Creek, too. So we think that this might be a clue from a hydrology infrastructure standpoint that might also impact and inform, maybe at the same time as the highway design, some of the decisions. And so this is a kind of a site-wide potential rainwater, stormwater management plan that we think also maybe should be considered fairly early on. And some Yale students actually tackled that as a form giver for their project. So that concludes my introduction. I wanted to only suggest that, like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, that transportation planning is one way to begin to think about the site at an infrastructural level, but certainly real estate economics, hydrology, and many other issues that we think would be important for the project should also be considered. And finally, of course, a vision for how those things add up to be a unique new neighborhood for Boston. Okay, is that? Yes.
Question.
Chuck.
Is there an intention to continue any kind of commerce uses of those yards in terms of distribution of products and materials and passage
Freight?
Freight and all that kind of stuff?
It's,
Is that being abandoned by
the CXS have moved their freight facility to Worcester. And this is simply a layover place to allow South Station to function during peak times. Occasionally, freight will be implicated in that if they're going out to Massport or heading over to MIT. But this is not meant to be in the plan a freight yard moving forward. And we'll have time for Q&A, I think, at the end. Plenty of time, I think, based on the schedule that Renee and I have come up with. So, is that good? Is that a good overview? Okay, thank you.
So good evening. Thanks very much for coming and welcome. My name is Renee Loth. I am the editor of this fine publication, Architecture Boston magazine, which is available at the desk over there. Limited number of recent copies, at which you'll also find the sign-in sheets, and we're hoping that you'll just leave some information for the organizers to follow up. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. We are here tonight to discuss this massive city building opportunity that's been presented to us by the potential development of the Beacon Yards area. and to at least ask, if not answer, some of the questions that have arisen as part of this opportunity. I want to thank Tim for organizing this. I think the overview was terrific and not too long, so that's good. This evening is part of the Boston Society of Architects' sort of ongoing civic engagement initiatives. There's a long, proud history, apparently, before my time here, of the BSA helping to catalyze conversations around the, built city, whether it was the high spine, development for Back Bay, or the envisioning exercises that were done to help plan the Rose Kennedy Greenway parcels, to more recent kind of engagement and design review of the casino proposals for Everett and Revere. And there'll be more of these, I'm told, in the coming year. I think some of the discussion areas might include, the development of needed workforce housing and how the city might respond to the challenge of sea level rise. So stay tuned for all of that from the BSA. So it's my pleasure. Ode, what did I do? Is that okay? I changed the hoo-ha. I'm afraid to touch anything here. So there's has that. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
I'll take this, and a few questions. I can even move the slides back and forth. So
you'll get back to what you want, and then
there we go. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. It's my great pleasure. Okay, to introduce the panel that we have tonight. It's a terrific group of people, and I'm just going to do this by alphabetical order. So if you could just raise your hands because you're not in alphabetical order. Gary Hildebrand, who is the principal of Reed Hildebrand Associates. I think everybody here knows him. He's also an adjunct professor of landscape architect at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. He's working on several important projects, but for our purposes tonight, it's interesting to note that he was part of the Harvard University's master plan development for their Alston campus, so he knows some of the players very well. Paul McMorrow over here is an associate editor of Commonwealth Magazine and, like me, a regular columnist for the Boston Globe's op-ed page. It was Paul who wrote that terrific piece in today's Globe outlining the BSA's initiative here on the Beacon Yards, and it's probably partly why so many of you were here today, so thank you. Paige Scott Reed is general counsel at MassDOT and the MBTA. She is just a mess of conflicts of interest because she is not only at MassDOT, but she's a Harvard Law School graduate. And she also lives not too far from where the imagined West Station would disembark. So, she's just a mess. But we're so happy to have representation from MassDOT here tonight. Thank you. Matt Urbanski, he's the principal of Michael Van Valkenburg Associates in New York, where he was the project director for the Brooklyn Bridge Park. Among many other, notable projects. And that one in particular I'm going to ask him about. He's also a professor of practice, in practice of landscape architecture at Harvard. And did I get everybody? I think it's Tim. Everybody knows Tim. He is the principal at UTIL, the incoming president of the BSA, as we heard, and he's also graduate programs director at Northeastern University School of Architecture, where he's currently directing a one-year research studio focused here on Beacon Yards. So we have a terrific panel tonight. Briefly, this is the game plan. I'm going to ask a different question of each of the panelists, and then we'll try to generate a little bit of a general discussion. And then there's, I think, a lot of interest in questions from the audience. Possibly we'll call also on Alex Krieger and Kishore Varanasi, who are the team leaders of this workshop/charrette that you've heard about that will happen tomorrow and the next day. And then we'll open it up to the audience at large. So if the panel could sort of keep your answers brief-ish so that we have opportunity for questions from the audience too. I'm going to start with Matt, if that's okay. Hello over there. Thinking about Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I read up on, and I have not seen myself, but it's just so successful. And it's relevant to us tonight because as the project director, you had to herd this, menagerie of cats, right? You had public interests, private interests, community interests. The site was really complicated, as this site is. There was historical sort of, interests to kind of manage, and lots of public attention and media spotlight and so on. So I'm wondering from that experience, because here too, we have all of these different stakeholders. We have Harvard and Massachusetts Department of Transportation, the state. We have community interests that are really active. What kind of recommendation can you give us here to help get the right kind of urban design outcome from that kind of, hydra-headed client that we have here?
Wow, that's a tough one.
No, it's not.
Nah, it's easy. Let's see. Thinking, Tim's. Thank God I heard Tim's introduction. Is this on?
Yeah, me too.
So it kind of oriented and got me to thinking about, how it might relate. And I think, one of the challenges here that we didn't have in Brooklyn Bridge Park, I think in some ways Brooklyn was more challenged in terms of it's right underneath the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. Brooklyn Heights is the oldest suburb of New York City. So despite the fact that no one practically had been on the site ever in their whole lives, they'd been looking at it their whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone was an expert on it. And one thing here is probably few people, feel exactly the same proprietary way about this. So that might be a little bit different.
You might be surprised.
Well,
Welcome to Boston.
Not in the same way that they've been looking down on it like a master planner. Like
Right.
literally, that's what the promenade does. It turns you into Robert Moses.
Yeah.
It's actually for everybody. It's 60 feet above the site, a public space, perfectly finished, beautiful public space, looking down on a completely unfinished public space, but also looking out at the Statue of Liberty and the western sunset and everything else. So everyone had been there looking at it for their entire lives, and which was good. But that also speaks to, I think, an issue, and Tim brought up an issue of the question of landscape urbanism. And people always ask me, so what's landscape urbanism? And we all make up our a self-serving answer. But I think there is an answer that is historic, that goes back to like the Olmsted examples, like the Fenway, for instance, and things like that. And that is that if you think about urban design as it's normally thought about, this is sort of an extremely exaggerated version of it. You design the roads, the circulation, and then you put the buildings in the pattern that you made, and then you green up other things that you can't figure out what to do with, right? The kind of that's unfair and totally honest at the same time, right? And works in a lot of ways. But in landscape urbanism, which is useful in a place that's a former margin like this is a real marginal, not in anybody's kind of mental map kind of place, right? In a place like that. And you could argue it was almost similar to the way Olmsted was making the Fenway. There was nothing there, okay? There's nothing here in people's experience. And so what is the there? What are you making it around? I had no problem in Brooklyn Bridge Park. There's this vast thing to look at, this vast borrowed landscape and the Statue of Liberty and the Brooklyn Bridge, by the way, and all this other stuff. And so, the there was never, ever a question. But as I look at this, I feel like that's the thing that I wonder about. And so my definition of landscape urbanism is you design the green space, the public civic space that's doing the work that needs to be done on the site, whether it's infrastructural, green infrastructure, but it's also urban connections. One of the funny things about these former margins is they wind up between things, and they therefore can give great connections that never were there in the city before because they were blocking it, and now they could provide it, right? I'm working on the Bloomingdale Trail, which is a rail-to-trail project in Chicago. It's the same thing. It used to be a divider, a former margin. Now it can be a joiner. Brooklyn Bridge Park is the same thing. It used to be something that divided the neighborhoods, divided people from the water. Now it connects them. So what is the utility from a urban connection perspective that this site can provide? What could the common space do there? And then, is there green infrastructural function, which is always nice and I love, but it's kind of, you could make anything work as a green infrastructure in a way.
Yeah.
You can kind of work it and replumb it and get it to work. But if you solve that problem earlier on, you'll solve it more inexpensively. You won't be doing underground storage tanks and all this crazy stuff that we get into if we think about it too late. So you think about that, you get this figure going of whatever the green space is that makes the there. And then you shape things, you kind of go backwards on that process that I was talking about. Then the buildings and the roads kind of reinforce that form. Now you're not really in that position to be, able to flip the whole process around here, but if you kind of took the charrette and you kind of looked at it, you pushed it the other way in the other direction, it might help to.
Well, that leads me. I wasn't going to go in this order, but it leads me to Gary and to asking you kind of to develop that idea. I mean, what happens if, and we're thinking about this site, transportation is not the first thing that we think about. It's not. It's kind of requires some, suspension of disbelief and all that. But what if we were to think about the landscape first or the site first instead of the transportation aspects of this project first? How might that change the way we think about it? What might happen there?
I think it would change a lot. Tim's slides were very useful for us all, and perhaps most particularly because they show the site over time. That sequence of slides going back to the origins of Salt Creek. I think there's a really big clue there. There's a reason why a creek is where it is. And that a creek is a fold basically in an estuarine system. I don't think we should be nostalgic about the creek or where it is. I don't think we should rebuild the river through the creek so much, but we should recognize that was a low point of drainage. And, Matthew's calling to mind that there aren't many other experiential qualities of that site which people might be attached to, maybe the engineers and the railroad guys. But other than that, most of us haven't been there. But we know that, somebody used to pick oysters in the creek. And we know that drainage goes from that escarpment, which is the northern edge of the west campus of BU. Escarpment's maybe too strong a word. And the plain that comes across from Western Avenue also drains in very flat. You think it's flat. It's not flat. No land is flat. So it's significant to me to wonder about what that crease, if you could call that just a crease in the land, is in relation to the sweep of what I would call the hardened Charles River. The Charles River is a hardened infrastructure. You saw that map of the high tide of the estuary, and of course that was a dynamic thing. You saw the edge as a kind of crenellation, because that's how land drains at the marsh. Really interesting to think about what that great big sweep in essentially what we could call a man-made basin. That's what happened, in the around 1910 when the Charles River Dam was finally completed. Somehow a relationship to there that hopefully gets around the problem of all the petroleum under the railroad tracks. So that's one thing. As I said, Matthew said this really. No one really knows what it's like to stand there and imagine the sweep of the Charles River Basin that way, or the rise back up to BU, because you can't see it today. And I think those things ought to, those are phenomenological things, they're historical conditions, and they need to be addressed. And they are more fundamental, in my view, than transportation.
Yeah.
I wonder if there should be a platform built, just a simple wood platform that's, I don't know, 12 feet off the grade in the middle of the site with accessible access and nice stair, just like a deck. And the task force should meet up there. And they should get up high enough that everybody can see, what the view's like up there.
I think it was probably
It might change people's minds.
a great place to be a cow, It was a great place to graze.
Until you went to the stockyard, then
think
it was not such a
probably
great place
really-
anymore.
It probably was a really good place to be on a buggy, and running around the track. I mean, that open, you were basically on the seacoast then,
Yeah.
right? And it should be a great place to be on the street or along that crease. And that crease really ought to be where people start.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I am going to, people are going to start being able to just pile in here. This conversation already is going in great directions, but I noticed that Paul wanted to say something. And I was going to just ask though, the community meetings that I've been to in Alston, I live in Brighton, part of the tension that I see already is between the sort of transportation and highway and even public transportation sort of imperatives here and all of the other stuff, And so I was sort of going to ask in your, whatever you have to say, if you could also weave in how to reconcile those things, city building questions and transportation questions.
So I think piggybacking off what, this is not very loud, huh?
Yeah.
Off what Matthew was saying about, this isn't the Brooklyn Bridge where you're standing on top of the site but not able to get at it. But I think the way that we all look at it is this map here on the back wall, the sort of the Google Map view of the world. And when you pull back on that, you see how close you are to Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
You see how close you are not only to Harvard and BU, but to MIT. You see when you zoom back a little bit that I'm a 10-minute trolley ride from North Station. I'm close to Sullivan Square. I'm close to Assembly Square. You see the site in the context of the next sort of 10 or 20 years of development in the city, and that's why it matters. And that the location and the context vis-a-vis all these places where the region's economy is going to be built on, where we're going to build the economy, that's what makes it matter. And if it matters, then it's worth getting the transportation right. Renee, I thought it's interesting that so your question was about transportation, but a lot of, from my point of view, a lot of the conflict between the neighborhood and MassDOT, it's a highway conflict. It's this sort of legacy DOT view of the world where everything's a highway project and we squeeze in walking and biking and transit around the highway. Where really this is a TOD project. This is Assembly Square. We have tracks running through this thing. We just have to run the trains. And to not, and then we're going to fit the highway around that, rather than starting with the highway and trying to figure out how do we get an effective transportation, mass transit network. Oh, and by the way, it'd be nice if we could sink some buildings around, somewhere in proximity to it. It's completely backwards. And the great thing about this process so far is that the neighborhood gets it, and they've been pushing back in a really effective manner.
Yeah. Well, so Paige, Paul mentioned, I'm going to give you an opportunity to defend MassDOT here, but Paul mentioned economic development, and we are in this boom time in Boston. The population of Boston is growing for the first time since 1950, the city itself. And yet, a lot of us worry about the choking on our own growth, because if you can't get people to their jobs and back to their homes, the economic, opportunities that we have here are going to, wither. So that brings in public transit. I guess my question to you, or just to answer Paul, but also how ambitious can we be here? Can we be thinking about, using this as an opportunity to finally sort of hook up North and South Station? Is this really an opportunity to bring back the much vaulted urban ring? Or are we just talking about, the highway and then maybe one additional stop? Even West Station seemed too ambitious once upon a time. So, how big can we think here?
Well, so I'm not going to touch some of those topics,
Okay.
but it's interesting to hear how the site and the project and the process have been described so far, because in some ways it's so different from how I understand the project
Yeah.
coming at it from where I sit.
Yeah,
So this process started before 2009 when the studio was being run. So in order for this to be a place where people could talk about city building, CSX had a freight yard, and that freight yard had implications for commuter rail and the ability to provide service to Boston.
And high-speed trains to Worcester, too.
And high-speed
Right.
trains to Worcester, and real transportation heart of the issues. And so an effort was made to take steps to unlock this parcel with the idea that it was not going to just solve the instant question, which was how do freight and commuter rail coexist together, but that it was going to be transportation reform at its heart. It was going to be talking about trains and talking about highway, and it was going to be part of the public interest in the sense of, well, what then happens if you can take down the spaghetti? What does that make possible? And in order to make that happen, it took a lot of transactions, some of which are still ongoing, in order to be able to take the sort of network of interest that exists on the site and move them a little so that you would free up this land that you could think about what would city building be here. So I think about the project as very much of a clearing away of this is a very, very complicated network of interest. How do we clear it away enough that you could think about something new? So to think about it as a blank slate, what should we do, is almost the opposite of how I come at the project. And also, I think in the long term, it's going to continue to be a complicated site. So CSX is never going to not have interest in this site, just to be clear. Harvard has interest in the site. BU has interest in the site. MassDOT is a conglomeration of different interests, so there are highway guys who have one sense of what this should be. There is transportation planning around rail. What will this be, and what would happen if we had DMUs? How would this fit?
Explain what those are.
How would this? So DMUs are basically a form of freight. Well, it's not freight. Rail car that has some of the characteristics of what you experience, for example, with a light rail like Green Line, because they can start fast and stop fast, but they can run on freight rail, so they can run on commuter rail tracks.
So more frequent service.
So
on it.
you could have more frequent service. You could have
Commuter
service
rails.
that runs between shorter distances. You don't have to do deadheading. It gets really complicated really fast. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a transportation person. But this site for us is about all of that transformation. It's about what kind of linkage will there be in the city in the future, not just what will the shape of the highway be.
But to be clear, and we might have different opinions on the panel, this is an excellent functional result of all that you're talking about. I mean, this is 9,000 times better than the current spaghetti, and it's quite rational relative to getting the things over and clearing up the land and having those streets line up with existing streets across Cambridge Street. I guess my only point is now is the time to bring other experts in addition to transportation planners. But I agree with you. any earlier than this might have been a mistake because a lot of those problems weren't solved. So I don't want
I guess-
MassDOT to think that we're criticizing what's been done, but only that today,
But you,
at this very moment, is the perfect time to start to considering these other issues.
So I guess I just want landscape architects and urbanists who come to the site to come to it with the complexity that's there. So yes, so far this is a cartoon, and it addresses very high level, very big picture issues like where could the rail yard be?
Right.
And it has to answer the fundamental question of straightening the highway, because you don't unlock the rest of it
Right.
unless you do
And
that.
getting off the highway.
But it's not, even getting on and off the highway, it is still really pretty much a cartoon. Those questions haven't been answered, and the character of the site that you free up hasn't really been answered, in part because there are lots of legal questions that haven't been answered. So one of the things that nobody has talked about so far is air rights. This site is likely to be air rights development in some significant way.
I'm not an air rights believer. I don't believe in it. I don't have a
They're
faith-based
very complicated
belief in
and
it,
difficult.
so-
No, but I'm just as a practical,
Right.
currently, a
Yeah.
lot of the rights that exist in the site exist in the form of air rights.
Oh, currently.
Legally.
I see.
And as you move forward, it's very likely that air rights will be a significant part of what happens on the site. So thinking about it as purely, we're going to put a rail yard here, we're going to put the highway there, and then someone will fill in the other space, probably cuts off a significant part of what's going to happen on the site. Because actually, there's probably going to be air rights development, maybe over the rail yard, maybe over the highway. And so the shape of what you're trying to fill could be significantly different.
Would you invite the two charrette teams to take a whack at that, or to remain?
So I'm not, again, that's one I'm not going to touch.
Invitation.
That's one I'm not going to touch. I think that I love to see good ideas. I think MassDOT has tried to be as receptive as they can be to innovation and creative thinking in, not just in this environment, but in all of the projects that we are currently working on. I guess I hesitate a little bit only because it is a complex legal web, and there are things that absolutely would be good ideas that MassDOT's not going to be able to do because of the way that the legal structure works and how we've got to satisfy CSX. We've got to satisfy Harvard.
Right.
So I don't want to be inviting it in the sense of whatever you say, if it's a good idea, we will necessarily do it. But I think all of the creative thinking about this that can happen will only make the project better.
I'm actually thinking now, just hearing about all of the stakeholders again, you know, who is really best suited to shepherd this, you know, a project of this complexity and this magnitude to some decent solution in the next, whatever it is, 7 to 20 years? I mean, is it MassDOT? Is it the, you know, so is it the city? Is it Harvard that owns like most of the land? I mean, is it some new entity that you know, some special purpose nonprofit or something that oversees this? I mean, it's been a long time, like since the Back Bay, that we've developed something quite like this in Boston, and
So I
it
have,
feels
I
like
have
that
a
to me.
strong feeling on that.
Go.
So I'm a big believer in the power of crowds. And right now, I really think what we have going is crowd decision-making. So MassDOT really doesn't come at this as though MassDOT could decide on its own how this is supposed to work and what will happen next. I think that's a great thing. So I tend to be in favor of just what you see at the site, which is lots of cross-cutting interest, lots of people who have the ability to stand up and say, this is the point of view that needs to be taken into account, and it's going to compete with the person who's sitting next to you, who also has the right to say, this is the way. And somewhere in that soup, I think you tend to come out with better decision-making than if you try and say, there should be one smart person who
Yeah.
thinks about all of it and comes
I
up
tend
with the
to
right
agree with
answer.
that too, although, we know democracy is very messy and often not very efficient. And so, one does wonder if anything will ever get done. A lot of talking, somebody's eventually got to be in charge. Paul here was,
No, I just
chomping
wanted
at the
to,
bit for a second.
I think that the kind of historical context of how long this play has been at work is important, and I think it's it's important as we sit here and nitpick at what DOT has put on the table to recognize that Rich Davey, the transportation secretary, gets it. Jeff Mullen, who had the job before him, got it. Tim Murray, who was the lieutenant governor who set up the CSX deal, was in it not just because he wanted a faster train to Worcester, which he did, but also because he understood the economic development potential of the site. And I think that sort of history makes it all the more important that we get this right, and that it not kind of be a bait and switch where we bought out CSX because it was a hell of an economic development play, but then we screw it up because we put the highway in the wrong place. I have no
Other-
longer answer. That's it.
Okay, I'm going to sort of move on to some folks in the audience, and I thought I would start with Alex Krieger if I see him out there, I think. Do you have something to add to this or a question to ask? And then also Kishore, are you right next to him? I think so, yeah.
Well, I suppose.
Oh, there's a microphone. Is there not?
Pulls right out of there.
Sorry. Thank you, Rich.
Well, I suppose we should encourage you just to come back Thursday afternoon. We don't want to spill the beans too early. But no, if you think this has been going on a long time, well, we've been working on the urban ring since 1908.
Mike Dukakis didn't
Not
invent
maybe-
that?
Actually, for about half of that time, it seems, right? For half of it, like it seems. So let me say, my concern, not about the charrette. First of all, Paige, I think that you dismiss the power of the engineering community a little bit too much. In the end, if they don't decide that it can be 55 miles an hour in here as opposed to 65 miles an hour, it's going to have great consequences on those ramps and the ability to develop the land. And it ain't going to be the public so far that seems to make that decision. And this is where oftentimes engineers' cartoons become cartoons on the ground. And hopefully that will not happen this time. So please don't say that, engineers will eventually do what we want them to do. That's not been the case so far in the history of American highway planning very often. Although sometimes, as a kind of guilty mitigation for building highways, we get some open space. That's how the Esplanade got there. That's how we got the Greenway. And maybe we'll get a little bit of stuff here as well. But the kind of the mirror to the engineering standards have to be maintained as arduously as anything else all the way through this process. A. B, let me quote no one ever thinks there was any other landscape architect in the 19th century other than Olmsted. Let me quote Horatio Cleveland, a very important, who said, "Look forward a century." Maybe he was thinking about the urban ring, I'm not sure, right? This is the moment to deal with north-south connections from Commonwealth Avenue to Alston to Cambridge. But the politics are not quite there for that to happen. This is the moment to, in fact, realize the urban ring on a proper trajectory towards Harvard Square, not because it's Harvard, but because that's where it's logical, and up into Somerville. If that doesn't happen this time, we'll be waiting another 100 years for this. This is the moment not to bring back the estuary necessarily, but to deal with that edge of the Charles River, which could change enormously as a consequence of that project. This is the moment to think long-term and to address issues that have been a concern for a long time, not just the highway, but these three other things. I could probably name another two or three, that now it is possible to potentially address. But I'm afraid that in the end, after 150 public meetings, we'll get a little bicycle path along the highway, and some of those, and that'll be a great concession, while The Charles River Edge will stay the way it is. The urban ring will look forward a century again, and the north-south connections that really should happen through one of the largest impediments in all of Boston between neighborhoods will stay the way it is. That would be a shame.
Thank you. I agree. Kishore, do you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, we have less than
Okay.
48 hours to figure out this problem, so no pressure. But your inputs are very, very valuable. And, you know, if you think of a site that is 70 or 80 acres in the heart of a city like Boston and Cambridge, with the kinds of investments that the state and the city and everybody has made, it better deliver tremendous amount of great public benefits, not just one type of use. Mix of uses, public spaces, access to transportation, all kinds of things. And you know, the sequence is questionable. What should have come first? What should have come later? But here we are, and the way we look at it is that how do you take advantage of what's on the table? And perhaps I'll make 2 points. It is at a preliminary level, how do you think of a relationship to the infrastructure and urban fabric in a way that we haven't thought before in Boston? Many other cities have done this. Infrastructure is not a bad thing. It has to exist. It works, and many cities have figured out how to work around them rather than make them disappear with huge expense. But at the same time, not turn the back towards infrastructure. So how do you work with the infrastructure and sort of translate that into an asset? And the other aspect is how the relationship between the urban fabric and the river. As you know, Charles River, I think this is a point that Alex is making, and its entire length is severed by transportation infrastructure, and the relationship is a very different one. And here we have a great opportunity to create a very different relationship. One more time, thinking differently about this site, this idea of the creek and how it relates back, and also giving the neighborhoods direct access to the river, not making them feel like they're going to somebody's backyard. So this is the site that can do that, and it can bring all the connections together. So that's what we're hoping to explore.
Yeah, thank you. You know, these are very inspiring thoughts, and, you know, I hate to be Debbie Downer here, but a question I have for anybody in the audience or for the panel is about money. You know, one of the proposals I saw up there on the screen earlier, you know, would be a favorite of mine because I live near there, is to, I think it is to sort of depress Soldiers Field Road, right? And clear up a whole bunch of land along the river there, right? Or move it, you know, to create a kind of esplanade, right, up there along the river. And, you know, great. But so we live in a time, unfortunately, where investments in the public realm are not the top priority of our leaders. And so I'm just wondering if anybody has any really bright ideas about the economic development or the economics of this site, as well as, you know, all the other things, the hydrology. Matt.
I think it kind of, my answer goes back to my first question, which is where you need to make something there that makes value. That's essentially what I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Alex Krieger taught me, you know, a long time ago, that the developers that developed the Back Bay at great expense, and for 40 years that it took them to fill it in, the first block they made was the public garden.
Mm.
Okay, they didn't. That was the first part of the development. They made there. They made. That's what I mean by that dumb statement. They made value, and you need to make value. I think there's a presumption that if we just clear it out, then everybody can rush in and be happy as hell here. But it doesn't. But I think Alex is saying, you know, there's a lot of things that could happen that would be way better than that, and make a lot more value and pay for fantastic things. But you can't get something fantastic if you don't do that. Like if you don't think about the edge of the river, for instance, you know, and you do just wind up with an excellent bike trail. You know, that was an incredible idea. I use it constantly all over the country. When people think, oh, I got an idea, let's make a landscape to create value. It's like, yeah, they've had that idea for a while. You know, in the Back Bay, they had it like a long time ago. But it's still the most valuable real estate in the world, practically. It worked, and it continues to work. And they created it by making a civic amenity that did something, that made connections, that connected to an existing civic amenity, and then connected to Commonwealth Avenue and connected different parts of the city. And these former, I don't know this site well enough, but these former margin areas are positioned to do that because they used to kind of prevent that. So they become like this kind of knot that allows, things that have been frustrated until then.
That's why
Tim.
the question of the management of this is actually a very important one, because if you take MassDOT and the Pike, you take DCR and Soldiers Field Road and their control of the Esplanade and the open spaces along the river, and you take potential real estate value, a third-party entity, let's call it the Beacon Yards Redevelopment Authority, has to take these interests one step removed and figure it out. And so, for the Matter-Bansky game plan, MassDOT isn't the right entity to figure it out, because the financing is only coming through the highway project, which is, by the way, a big gift and a smart diagram, by the way.
Yeah.
But who's going to capture, this is a rough diagram, and this is not a good plan, but who's going to capture, who's going to create the value for this stuff to come, which is Matt's Park or whatever it is, and then that has value that also, MassDOT pays for the highway to move. Maybe this stuff pays for DCR to move Starro Drive so that this actually comes. So there's a larger business deal here that has to be tied to an urban design vision that has to transcend the highway project. The highway project is a big piece of it. It's actually the catalyst, both in terms of clearing the site and getting that's why I think the time is perfect, actually.
The highway project, to me, when I think about Brooklyn Bridge Park, which was a freight terminal basically that for New York City, is the closing of the terminal in a way. That's what the highway project. Like, we couldn't think about making Brooklyn Bridge Park if they were still needed to use it for something else.
Right.
So now they've been able to consolidate that into a different part of the Brooklyn waterfront. So that allowed it to happen. But we had something that was the legacy of Robert Moses. It was a subsidiary of the state government. It was called the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation. Guess what? It still exists. Their goal was not to just monetize the asset, which was what the issue was when we had the Port Authority controlling Brooklyn Bridge Park. They wanted to get out of there. They wanted to do something responsible, monetize the asset,
RFP, get out.
develop the thing, and get out of there. And that turned out to be, you're next to some rich neighborhoods. That didn't work out. And so they had to make a subsidiary like Battery Park City, like your example, like the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, like all of these different things. It was an act of the state legislature, and it was consolidated. And the reason why is because everyone believed that could be a park, and that park would create a special thing there. And by the way, it's called a park, but it's got development as part of it. It kind of reconnects the waterfront, so it's more valid in the comparison here than it might sound to people that don't know the project. But the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation was created, and it brought all of those other things
But
together.
they worked out the whole financing package.
Yes.
Because it's not like there was oodles of money in New York at the time either. There had to be,
Well, that's why it
again,
happened.
a public-private financing structure that was tied to a vision and a diagram where private development, a publicly funded infrastructure project, and all the pieces could come together.
So I have to push back a little bit on that. I mean, my sense of it is that the public investment has largely been made. And this is just me speaking. This is
Right.
not the state speaking. This is Paige Scott Reed.
Right.
There has been a lot of invested in making a space where something fabulous could happen. Getting from there being space for something fabulous to happen to something fabulous actually happening,
Right.
it seems to me is in part about coalition building. So I think what you're doing here and what you're doing over the next 2 days is an incredibly important part of it. My sense of it is developers are going to look at this land. Harvard is going to have some ideas about what it wants to accomplish on this land.
Right.
And how those things come together on the ground is going to have a lot to do with imagination. So if a bright idea is put out there about imagine this edge of the Charles in a particular way and development flowing off of that, and this land next to it will be worth more if you create this space, you can
Right.
imagine it happening, but I think it has to grow
Out of the idea.
that way. I don't see how, given my basic belief in private property rights, how you could have this be a public-private partnership that is pushing that kind of a bright idea, because quite frankly, there's not a whole lot of public ownership for you to have that input. You'd have to take something, so you'd have to come up with the money
Right.
to take it. Part of the reason the process has been as long as it has been is because this all had to happen without coming up with a giant pot of money
Right.
to take the space where the yard and the
Right.
highway will sit.
There's a balancing of value between Harvard and MassDOT at the end of the day.
And CSX.
And
You had
CSX,
so
right.
so it had to
Right,
be
right.
a trade, and it had to be that MassDOT is in some sense creating the value that it's spending. So we are giving up rights on the spaghetti. Those rights will be more valuable now that the spaghetti is
But
gone.
I'm right with you. I'm in the Page zone. But how do we get DCR to play to generate value within captured real estate value? So the question is, let's say as a principle, we can all agree, it'd be nicer if we could move Starro Drive in or have it go down, or if we could fix that edge, which will unlock the value of that whole thing, right? Starro Drive is a barrier that it would be nice to build a parallel road a little bit inboard that goes down so that you don't turn the thing off. And the question is, how is that financed? And the way that's financed is relative to the same equation that you're talking about. There's a discussion with Harvard that goes along the lines, and I'm completely making this up now, which is we need to speculate on the value of your land by actually drawing a vision for it so that somebody can count the beans, so that it pencils out that so that DCR can actually meet Starro Drive. You can't do one without the other. This is back to Matt's point to begin with, that otherwise you're still trapped between transportation infrastructure. You can build some big labs there or whatever, but it's not going to be the cool neighborhood that's really going to drive value for Harvard, by the way.
Which I think is exactly what I think I'm saying exactly
I
what
think
Matt
we're all
said at the
saying the same
thing. Yeah, we're saying
beginning,
the same thing.
which
That's
is
good. That's
if
good.
you create something that is cool enough, you will throw off value to the land that's next to it.
Right.
And
Cool enough but not crazy.
a developer who is just counting the beans would rationally say,
Right.
okay, I'm going to devote this much of the land that I'm investing in to building this cool thing, and then I'm going to monetize everything that's next to it, and I think I'm overall going to come out with more value
Right.
than had I just built, Howard Johnson's on the whole
Right.
Paul, what do you
Yeah.
think?
So I just the context I think is important in this statement that the state has spent or has allocated the money it's going to allocate. Let's talk about why that is. So we see the red down at the bottom corner. That's a bridge that's falling down. The state has to fix it anyway because it doesn't want cars falling on top of trains. That work's going to happen. The state is getting rid of toll booths and doing all electronic tolling. To do that, they need to straighten out the highway, or else the geometry doesn't work. That money is being spent anyway. This current administration wants to commit toll money, I believe, to a project here. So in the event that we have a Republican governor, they can't get rid of tolls because the money is spent already. This is a calculus that is pre-existing. And I think we have in the capital plan for the MBTA and DOT money allocated to buy these DMU trolleys. And so the question at this place is, with all of that already happening, can we make it add up to something that is more than just we're spending a bunch of money and we did it? Can it add up to something that actually creates value? Matt raises a really interesting question about how you create value. Parks are a great way. Another great way that we've been creating value lately is with transit stations. And this is what's drives me crazy about this project and West Station is that the transit is what creates value. The resistance to designing and funding West Station makes no sense because it's what drives the entire project. It's not the highway that passes through it. It's the train station. And particularly if you have a train station that is built so it has GMUs running to North Station and to South Station, then you have a bunch of value. And then you have a bunch of vehicles on the state side where you can capture the value that you're creating and use it to do some of the really cool things. But if you don't have the bigger picture and you don't have the transit to create the value, it's not going to get off the ground.
I want to bring some of the audience in here because I know there's a lot of hands. And there's a microphone in the back, and I'm having a little hard time seeing, so I'm just going to start with, yes, hello. Somebody's already got the microphone, excuse me. Go, and
I'll
then
be
we'll
happy
bring
to
it over
pass
here.
it to whoever you ask me to next.
Yeah, maybe
Glenn-
you want to identify yourself and just,
Sure.
whatever.
Glenn Berkowitz, I'm on the board of Livable Streets Alliance, and I also am one of the 50 or so members of the task force. And I just wanted to pose something to the panel and ask you to see if you have any ideas on how to solve what I'm going to suggest might be a hypothetical, which is that maybe the state sold this land in 2003 to the wrong entity to accomplish everything that you're all suggesting could be unlocked. And that's the hypothetical. I'd just like to give you a couple pieces of background. So the state in 2003 sold this land to Harvard for approximately $75 million. It needed the money really badly for something. The state did. So now, 10 years later or so, the state's about to spend north of $250 million to unlock the value. And once all these details get worked out that you all have talked about, it sounds like you all agree that this will be one of the most phenomenal potential economic development opportunities in the Boston region, if not any major urban area in the country. But here's the hypothetical I wanted to pose to you. What if the landowner, as to quote Alex's quote, is literally thinking 100 years ahead and has no plan to do anything with the property until 100 years from now? In other words, look back at the old photographs of Harvard Yard and Harvard University being built on the north side of the Charles River, and they bought the land where Harvard Business School is now and let it stay empty for 75 years, literally, I think, then built what we now all see there as Harvard Business School and everything. And maybe they bought this land similarly thinking that their goal is to just literally be the wealthy, those people who we all wonder who they are, who own land but have so much money they don't need to develop it for a while, which never seem to be any of us or our friends. What if all this amazing infrastructure stuff happens and the landowner has no intention to literally do anything and doesn't financially need to? So my question to you in a nutshell is this a possible, what was that lawsuit in Connecticut with economic development, Kelo versus something of New London? Is
The
it
eminent domain case.
Is it possible that Boston shouldn't allow this 75 acres of amazing potential economic development to literally lay fallow for the next 100 years? And maybe the wrong entity owning the land, maybe we should do something about the ownership of the land so that, in fact, this economic potential that you're all talking about actually gets created.
But this is like a little bit like the what if John F. Kennedy was never assassinated? I mean, the scenario is, I mean, because
Well, I think, can I just,
Yeah.
for what it's worth, I think there is a way to answer the question
Right.
or to think about the question, which is what leverage does the state or any of these other entities have over the landowner, Harvard, to, try to make sure something happens
Yeah.
there?
I was going to
If
reframe
any.
the question in a
Go ahead.
slightly different way.
Yeah.
I mean, so take that hypothetical. What if Harvard's interests are not in what happens to the land over the next 75 years, but only year 76 and on?
Yeah.
What does that mean? What should the proposals be for the site? right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily follow that because Harvard's own purposes don't require it to use the land right now, that that means it should be a wasteland. Maybe there are some proposals that would be of benefit to the public now, would be consistent with what Harvard is planning in year 76, and would create value in and of themselves. So to me, I think there is some interest in actually delving deeper into the question of the hypothetical. What if this is not a landowner who is talking massive development tomorrow? What if they're talking, this could be public use for 76 years?
Could
What
be worse. Yeah. Where's the microphone? So you have the microphone? Okay. Are you, Gretchen, are you managing the microphone? Okay, fine. Okay, good. Then come around to the
I
front
did
after
not
this.
grab it.
Thank you.
My name is Mark Older, among other things. I was the head of the BRA team that started the planning for conversion of the Charlestown Naval Shipyard, South Boston Naval Annex, which are examples of successful projects of a similar magnitude. I would like to make two comments on transportation very quickly. One, to just talk about transportation without modifiers really confuses this whole project. You've got to talk about regional transportation, the highway and the rail system. You've got to talk about, I don't have the word for it, but let's say sub-regional transportation, that is how this site connects into the existing fabric outside the site. And finally, internal transportation within the site, which could do a lot to change the geography of how it's developed if you think 100 years ahead or even a few years ahead and look to new technologies that are already been developed, I'm going to say along the line of automated transit, personal rapid transit, which are not just new technologies that are being developed, that have been developed, but also reflect the interest of the incoming entrepreneurial students who don't want the car, who want something that will be more efficient, and that properly done, allow for much more efficient use of land in a large site such as this.
Yeah, thank you. Any response to that? So I think, Tony, I want to call on you. If I can get the microphone. And then whatever, others.
Yes. Yes. My name is Antonio Di Mambro. I was a student at MIT in 1970.
Speak up a little bit.
I was a student at MIT in 1970 when I began to look at this site. And I was fortunate to be involved in a study that Harvard has done, one of the many in the past few years, where many of the things that you are raising were clearly analyzed. What came out from that experience is that we have a big problem here. We know what could be there, and the problem that we have is the other two elephants in the room that we haven't talked about yet. Boston University and MIT. And these three great institutions that define the genius of this place haven't been able to have a civilized dialogue as we and you all are having tonight. I think Harvard is not going to spend all the money that it has spent and sit on it. And the reason is that we, as a region, have imposed on that site West Station. That 10 years ago was not on the map, but is on the map. And that has to be the genesis of the transformation of this site. And we need to pay attention to what the engineers want to do there, because they are making a big mistake already. They want to do only 4 tracks. I think it should be 6 tracks, because we need to have sometime this century the high-speed rail come to Boston and stop there, and then from there the circumferential transit that I agree we should explore whether or not it goes to Harvard Square and some other place. So I don't buy that Harvard is the owner of this site. They may own it, but this is our site. And I invite the other 2 institutions not to play the game that they are playing, because only if the 3 institutions that control the edge of this site decide to make here the most unbelievable thing. The new face of Harvard, MIT, and BU is here. It's not something that they are. Why? Why we are going to do a West Station? And BU tells us right there, don't touch don't cross into my site. Wait a minute. What do you mean we cannot cross that site?
They're
With
public
all
streets,
the
right?
explosive opportunities that are there. This is Boston, guys. This is and what I have given you is a glimpse of the Boston of the 20th century. I want all of us to think about Boston in the 21st century. And don't be afraid about the money, and don't be afraid about the engineers. They are going to do fantastic things with roadways and the station here. I love engineers. Is that we need to tell them what, and we are not able to tell them what until these 3 institutions, the greatest institution of our region, decide to collaborate.
Thank you. Nicely put. Sir, go ahead.
My name is Cy Mintz. I wanted to point to this map, and then I was going to ask Tim maybe to have a slightly different one of the other ones. What you notice here is that you only notice, if we want to call it north of this area, where Harvard is, where Harvard Street is, etc. If you actually look the other way as well, you discover that you've got Commonwealth Avenue, Brighton. That's a better map. And what it also says to you is that this site is at the knuckle of where the Charles River does its bend and allows you to look downtown, one of the few places that, in fact, if you're there, if you want to use the younger word, awesome view of Boston, you would find that's one of the places to do that. So it seems to me, I'm picking up a little bit on my friend and colleague, Alex, this is a site that we're never going to have again along the river. We're just never going to have it. And we got it in a variety of ways that's already been discussed. But it seems to me that we ought to be looking at this site not in terms of just the institution, nothing against Harvard, nothing against MassDOT, etc. It ought to be looked at and developed in a way that it's an asset to the city. By being an asset to the city, which is not just a master plan with a bunch of buildings or taking Kendall Square and dropping it on this piece of land, that would be, to me, a travesty. I'm not against Kendall Square. I'm not against Seaport, but we don't need it everywhere. This is a place where you need something quite different. And I think thoughts that all of you have expressed about maybe a different entity that has to do this. This is a unique opportunity. we look back in history, we talk about Olmsted, we talk about Storrow Drive. We wouldn't have an Esplanade if people took the same attitudes that we seem to have today. We're afraid, which is what my good friend Antonio said. We're afraid to be bold enough to be able to say, we've got to take this unique opportunity, and sure, transportation provides money for us to be able to do this. Instead of us doing a transportation project with little touches of land use around it, this ought to be a project that we do what's best for the site, because in the long run, it's going to generate the economics all around it. Thank you.
Nicely done. Thank you. I was going to ask Gretchen, what is our time frame? Nobody's ever told me that.
I think we're wrapping up at 8:30.
8:30, okay.
About 20 minutes.
Oh, we have some more time. Oh, excellent. Are there more?
There's been a few hands here that have been consistently raised.
Okay, good. And I just thought there might have been some response. Here, it's back to you. But I thought there was some response maybe from the panel to some of that. No? While we're finding
No, I mean, I think that Antonio's vision of the 6 tracks and having that be a hub, even to connect to MIT, is an idea that I hadn't thought about before. And I think that in a way, that's where transportation planning and a citywide vision, starting with the station, might be one way into this, actually. I mean, those that have been involved with this process over the last couple of months know that station even showing up on the map is a development. It's earth-shattering. So now that it's there, I think that people can start to think about it in much more creative ways.
I think that was a very moving thing, and Antonio, you always speak in that manner of being moved by what you think about. This will go somewhere because of pressure. That's what I take from your comment. 100 years ago, you wouldn't have a room full of all of these interests pushing the landowner and the operator around, right? But today, it's clear that something like that station, which is so dreadfully needed, and which will become, it'll take something from what is today the margin and make it the middle. It'll be the West Middle. There's pressure. No one's going to sit on this. It's going to move because there is a feeling of pressure. I think it's a great comment.
Over here.
Hi. So I'm Jessica Robertson. I'm on the task force, and my house is about halfway between the Alston and the red dotted line. So first of all, I just want to say I'm really excited to see what you all are putting together over the next couple days. We on the task force have been trying to talk about land use for a long time and getting not a lot in return, so this is great. I also, in response to some of the earlier comments about, feeling like there's a there, or that, people actually are aware of what this is, I would invite you all to come out and stand on the Cambridge Street overpass, where you have a gorgeous view of the rail yard and the skyline and everything. And then I also wanted to respond to something that was said a little bit earlier about DCR, which is that they have actually, in the task force process, been very actually sort of forward-thinking and willing to think about interesting new things. We have so far successfully advocated for them to move part of Soldiers Field away from the river, but only the part that's under the viaduct. And some of us in this process are really, interested in thinking about the much bigger picture, the much further future that's been talked about tonight already, like when we have self-driving cars and we don't need as many roads and, et cetera, et cetera. A certain number of regional throughways are good for certain reasons, but what if we don't really need Soldiers Field at all? Can we think of a way to completely get rid of that and reopen up the waterfront? So I'm hoping that in all of the thinking that you all are doing over the next couple days, to think about that in a really big way, to think about how some of the other transportation things that we've been talking about a lot, you know, could there be a way to have some sort of urban ring, whether it's bus rapid transit or, you know, DMUs or all of the above? You know, the fact that it's a 5-minute bike ride from my house to Central Square, but currently almost no one actually wants to make that bike ride. You know, how can we knit these pieces together? Because this neighborhood, one of the things I absolutely love about living in this neighborhood is it's right in the middle of everything. And it doesn't feel like that now. It only feels that way if you ride your bike everywhere. So how can we sort of capitalize on that and really think big and make this sort of the central place that it really is, you know, trying to be?
Right. Well, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carol Ridge Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of Alston Brighton Community Development Corporation. I think all of this is wonderful, and I think it's really great to open up the creative thinking around the land use for this project. The only thing that I find a little lacking, I'm a neighborhood planner by trade, and I'm a little concerned that there's not a lot of thinking that's going on around what the neighborhoods are that already exist here. So if you look at where they're thinking of building West Station, there's the Gap neighborhood that's right in here that has become almost entirely student housing. So it's all privately owned, old Victorian homes, but it's almost entirely rented out and it's student housing. If you look at the neighborhood where it says Cambridge Street and you've got the green little park right in there, that's Hopedale Wyndham Street neighborhood, which is a lovely small neighborhood that is mostly owner-occupied, has a long history actually as being somewhat of an African-American community because it's where the porters from the railroad used to buy their houses. So you've got all of that in there, and then you've got what was at one point a very highly owner-occupied neighborhood that is turning predominantly investment, but has some very nice housing in it that we've been spending an enormous amount of time thinking about how we stabilize it. So when I think about this, and I think about what's happening over on Stadium Way and East Drive, hopefully that will happen, which I think it's not incredibly clear when it will happen, which is always an issue, is that how do we integrate all of this into what we already have in our neighborhoods and what's stable and what's already working there? And also, how do we think about Cambridge Street and what will eventually happen there? Because as you drive all the way down Cambridge Street away from Harvard in Brighton, that you think about, you know, what we could do there, you know, in terms of bringing down more of the whole area of Alston Main Streets. So I would encourage you, when you all are doing this team stuff, that you take a look at our existing neighborhoods, you know, because it's not just about this. It's also about what's around here. What will West Station do to the Gap neighborhood? And, you know, what will happen to the rest of this? And that's really important, I think, for us to at least keep in mind. Thank you.
Yeah. Vernon, you want to? Okay. That's all right. I'll get Vernon next. Go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. So I am also a task force member. My name is Alana, and I actually run Alston Village Main Streets. And again, thank you guys. I want to echo all of those comments. One thing that was standing out to me in this conversation is, so Tim Love, when your students took that beautiful little puzzle piece of this property and put it all over the city, Harvard actually owns a lot more land in Lower Alston than that. Significantly more land. In fact, I think if we even go back a few slides, you guys can look at some of the land that has gone undeveloped in Alston for a decade, which I understand on the scale of Harvard, and I don't want to disparage one of the top employers in the state and one of the most esteemed institutions in the world. But 10 years is a generation. It's a generation economically. It's had incredible impact on the value and the potential of the neighborhoods that Carol was just pointing out. And I think that what we've been doing so much of on the task force and why we're all so grateful to have you guys as part of this dialogue is really just trying to make the case that without significant input from state and local government, Harvard might not actually do anything. Because, I mean, I only know what I know, and I know that sometimes Harvard doesn't do things. And I also sort of wanted to point out that part of what makes this project possible and what makes it so exciting is that Harvard actually owns it, right? I mean, so the state really, Paige, you did a beautiful job of talking about the different stakeholders, but there's a lot fewer than there were when you guys were trying to build the Mass Pike in the first place, and you were dealing with hundreds of people who were living in their homes, right? And that's just in my neighborhood, so we're probably talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So this actually, from a stakeholder perspective, is probably a much simpler project than a lot of what the state's already doing. Imagine if we were trying to move the Mass Pike in the South End, for instance, or in some other neighborhood that's directly impacted by it. So I really want you guys to take into mind the scale and the scope of what Harvard owns and the fact that the community has been fighting for a very long time. Many of the people on the task force have been sort of the stand-up people there. One more second. I just wanted to touch on what Jessica brought up earlier, the idea of the there, right? So if you look to the south of this project, there's actually houses on that street. Sorry. There are houses on that street. There are families and children and college students who live 9 feet away from a commuter rail line that shakes their house every time it goes by. And beyond that, I mean, we just did a walkthrough with Mayor Walsh last weekend of Cambridge Street talking about other infrastructure issues. And one of the city employees who joined us was telling me about how his father worked in that rail yard the whole time he was growing up in South Boston. I mean, there is absolutely a there. That is one of the economic driving forces of our community historically that helped create a lot of these neighborhoods around there. I mean, so this is a space that is valued, and it's valued for more than just its relationship to 3 major institutions that will never pay property taxes. It's valued for its view of downtown Boston and its proximity to the river and its potential to be a place where maybe one day, as one of those young people that might not ever be able to afford a home, I could actually afford a home with some decent input from state and local government and with some brilliant thinking from thought leaders like all of you in this room. So thank you guys again for doing this, and someone else should talk now.
Yeah. I can't see anything from here, so happy to.
Can we go to Valerie? And
Sure.
I'm told that Alex has something.
Sure, and then, okay. And I think Vernon wanted to say something.
Chuck.
Chuck, excuse
And the
me.
panelists
I'm sorry, I'm blind up here. I can't see a thing. Thank you.
Shorter
Hello.
than Antonio right there.
Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Valerie Schulman, co-chair of Common Boston, another committee here at the BSA that plans events such as this one, or similar to this one, and wanted to take a minute to let you know we're getting ready to launch Fall Fest, which has several tours within Allston and Brighton community and Kendall and MIT, and we see this Charles River as a place in between. And we have a design build competition, 72 hours, at a site that will be announced at our kickoff on October 2nd. So I took a little bit of time to promote that, but I do have one straightforward question for the panel. In this planning, is the Grand Junction rail line thought of as part of this project and potential here, or as a separate project that would expand transportation, community connectivity, and everything else?
I mean, I think that to respond to a couple of the comments, given the short time frame, we really are going to use the power of physical design of a fairly concrete area to raise issues that haven't been raised before. So I think that while there are ideas about West Station that Antonio raised and others about other ways that it can function, really the team leaders are charged with finding a solution or two for the site that inspire a different way to think about it than through the discussions that have happened to date. That's really it, because we just have 2 days. So this will not result in comprehensive plans that maybe do all the I want to tamp down expectations of your hopefulness about what Alex and Kishore can do in 2 days. I think what's been missing but from the discourse is the way that design speculation itself, a scheme or two that maybe has a park in the middle and has buildings of a certain scale and a look and feel that people can respond to, needs to be part of the discussion. So I just want to, as a way to set the expectations here, be very clear about that. That design speculation is as much a way that we can think about and imagine a site as all the other discussions that have happened to date. I just want to, I don't know if that helps.
Yeah. I'm going to seize the prerogative here now, and I'm going to give this microphone to Chuck and then to Alex, and then I'm going to have you wrap up. Okay? Is that okay? All right. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chuck Rudman. I would like to say that you need to do the opposite of what you just said. I think if you stare at your navel on this site, you will miss the opportunity of how it is a catalyst for connecting to other things.
Right.
I also think you need to invite Cambridge to give you their maps. If you look at some of the previous maps, it's classic balkanized Boston. The middle of the Charles River is the end of the world.
Right.
Anything across it is in a never land. No, you have another map. You've had it before. I think that's very important. And what the other people talked about was the edges around this site. Yeah, that's a good map. See,
Right.
it's white.
I didn't make this map, by the way. I want to be very clear, Chuck.
I don't care.
Nothing.
But
I'm not the author of
you're
nothing here.
responsible for creating the setting for thinking.
I see. This is why I didn't ask you to be a team leader.
I think the issue of how this leaks out 1,000 feet on all edges needs to be part of your discussion. And how it integrates with the neighborhoods that were very brilliantly described that exist there that need to be preserved, and what it talks about for the connection to Commonwealth Avenue. The West Station is one of the keys. You should be able to get north and south without any effort. So I would encourage you to think in the dot, but also around the playground.
Great.
Alex? No. You has been very active over there.
I are most of the speakers. Well, just a couple of things. First of all, Paul, I'm glad you mentioned that this is not an act of altruism on the part of state. They have to rebuild the viaduct and they have to remove from tolls. This is not altruism. This is to repair a highway, hopefully for our benefit. One. Two. Two. Well, I don't need to repeat that. I think people have heard, right? The folks, there's a couple of all kinds of issues, obviously. One is the person who spoke about the sensitivity of the neighborhoods. Beware of how much ambition you expect us to arrive with, because if this becomes the next, important downtown-related district in the city, I think the neighborhoods will undergo a much more difficult transformation than you may think. Right. But thirdly, let me say something else about value. Let me imagine a site. There's a site on a highway interchange that without one traffic signal gets you all the way to Seattle. There's a site that has a transit station on it. There's a site that faces a major urban river. There's a site that is next to two, I'm not sure about MIT, but two important institutions that touch it. MIT is across the river. Right? That site has enormous value. Improper planning can only diminish that value. So I'm not worried about how to add value to a site. I'm worried about whether or not the planning underway winds up diminishing the value inherent to the site. And that should be one of the objectives of the entire enterprise. And I'll stop on that.
Tim, you want to bring it home?
Well, I guess,
Can I say just
Paige,
one thing
please.
first? I'm
Paige is going to
sorry.
bring it home.
I talk a lot.
I just wanted to touch on something that's been mentioned a couple of times about this. This is not altruism on the behalf of the state, and I think that's absolutely true. That if the plans for this site depend on altruism, then they're not that likely to happen. That the reason this site is exciting to me is because there are some very real-world practical things that need to happen, and those interests have been used as a driver to try and make something even more happen. So the project that started way back when could have been plainly figure out a different way to share with CSX so that commuter rail doesn't get delayed by freight. Or it could have been find a way to straighten the highway that has nothing to do with moving CSX freight yard, that has nothing to do with creating the cleanup that nobody's talked about, but there's been part of the transaction was to create cleanup at the site. And it's those same kinds of strategies that I think have the power to actually get something done. I don't think any of this is about altruism. I don't think that's I don't think it's likely to get much done.
Right.
If I can just add one thing we haven't mentioned, which is the big elephant in the room, which is the city, which has the ultimate regulatory authority in making this happen, expediting or not expediting it. So there is
Yeah, you have to say that again.
So we're talking about the role of the city of Boston in this instance, and its regulatory power to ultimately make this site happen. If the city, there are many instances around the world, including in this city, where city has proactively planned, came up with checks and balances. This is the investment that's made. Working with the communities, these are the results that we want out of a site like this, and this is what we're going to give the landowner in return. And once you set that zoning or rezoning in motion, nobody can stop development in this city. It's not going to be 75 years. So I think that dynamic needs to happen here. Hopefully this is the first step towards the process. We create a vision that city can embrace and take it to the next level.
Okay, maybe just to wrap this up, because we're done. I want to go back to the kind of latest and greatest MassDOT, slide. There might be a different one after Thursday's meeting. It's fine. I want to come back to the point that I think the timing is perfect, because all of the things that Paige has talked about are completely true, including the real politic issues of who's paying for what. And I think that what's happened here is that we're at a point now, except for those spaghetti strings that connect the highway frontage roads to Cambridge Street, where there is a blank slate there with a functional diagram that more or less works, and a station there for the first time after some advocacy, after a long time when it wasn't there, which is precisely why, relative to all things that have been said, to fill that in, at least try it twice, let's call them scenarios and not plans, to look at two different visions of what could go into that blank slate will have all kinds of value for everybody who's been involved with this to date, which is, I don't know how you go any further without knowing what drops in there, at least a first pass at it. So that's how we should consider what Kishore and Alex and their teams are going to produce, which is a draft take at, the land's been cleared, the diagram works, the levels are more or less identified, and there's a section for each of those roads. Let's fill it in and see what it looks like, and see, and then we'll really react to that. They're not recommendations; it's scenarios that we can then react to in terms of look and feel, density, the value creator or not, how we tinker with Starro Drive to add more value there. I think it's going to be an incredibly useful exercise, and it's going to change the debate fundamentally.
But Tim, my takeaway tonight is don't only look at that site.
Well, I don't think they will.
No, you cannot. I mean, because I think the tenor here is that whether that's an FAR of 2, which when I saw that I thought, wow, how could that be?
Right.
What if it were an FAR of 8? I now think maybe an FAR of 2 is reasonable. What are the patterns that we need to identify and to hold onto over the long, long duration of the project? We can fiddle with the block structure. And, I came tonight prepared to talk about that. Our Seaport Square blocks are too large. East Cambridge, not right. we can get that right. Can we get connectivity?
Right.
That's really big. And
Right.
can we like feel the river?
Right. Okay, that's.
Everybody come on Thursday. It's going to be worth coming for. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, for coming, providing.